I've always been someone who lives outside of the box. I grew up on a farm nestled into the bluffs along the Illinois River near Mossville, Illinois. This was the same farmhouse my grandma had been raised in 60 years earlier. It was no castle, but I loved it. My childhood involved running around outside in flip-flops and hand-me-downs, going for rides with my grandpa or uncle in the combine or tractor during harvest, collecting eggs, taking care of any number of outside cats, helping my mom shell peas from our garden, and dumping the old milk jug full of eggshells, banana peels, and other household food scraps over the fence to the geese. And many mornings, my grandpa would come across the street, sit at our breakfast table, and check on us before heading out to do any number of farm tasks. My mom's parents, Grandpa and Grandma Hannah, lived across the road from our house. This isn't across the street like in a neighborhood. The lane that led from our house to Mossville Road was probably a quarter-mile long, and I felt pretty important when I was finally able to walk from our house to theirs by myself. I always felt special being at my grandparents' house, even if I helped with the same type of gardening tasks that we had at home. One of my favorite activities with my grandparents was cherry picking. My grandpa would get out his John Deere 4020 with a loader, and he'd allow me to stand in the bucket, and he'd raise the scoop high into the cherry tree so that I could pick the fruit. Now, I can't believe that my parents allowed this. But I was the oldest and the most responsible, so it only made sense that I got to be dangerously high off the ground, my picking bucket clipped in my summer shorts, sticky fingers picking the fruit, with my favorite farmer in the bucket next to me. When the picking was done, we'd sit under a shade tree, a bowl of cool water on our laps, pitting the cherries to be frozen for any number of Grandma's desserts. It always grossed me out if I'd get a cherry that had a worm in it and squeeze it, and that little brown sandy stuff would come shooting out. That cherry went into the waste bucket. But for many years, I had a special shirt that I'd only use for cherry pitting, and it was stained with all those special moments with my grandparents. For me, this life ended when I was 10 and we moved to Decatur for my dad's job. Now, at that point, I didn't feel that it was ideal, except that we got 2 bathrooms and central air conditioning. Big deal for 5 people. The downside, though, was that we moved to a neighborhood on a half-acre lot about 100 miles away from my grandparents. Our garden was a shell of its former self. There were no good climbing trees. The biggest livestock I could have was a rabbit. And doing the sweet corn processing in the summer without my grandma wasn't any fun. It was just hot and miserable. But I sure did enjoy its yummy flavor in the winter. If you've only had squeaky canned corn, it's hard to explain just how much better homegrown is. I'd spend a week or so with my grandparents each summer, and I tried to time it around cherry picking, but sometimes it was more corn or black raspberry picking time. Food on Grandma's table was always homemade. Dessert was often canned fruit of some sort, being cherries or peaches that she'd canned, or a home-baked pie or cobbler. And every year on Washington's birthday, she'd bake a cherry pie. In the fall of 1995, a friend got me a job helping with student ID pictures at Milliken's student orientation. Now, it was my first day as a scared freshman on campus, and I met this really nice guy that was a few people down the table from me. And one of the first things I learned about this chemistry major was that he helped his family farm. My favorite type of person. His mom canned tomatoes and green beans and had a huge garden. And Joe knew how to drive a tractor. The first time I saw him climbing up into that big John Deere in his dirty jeans, work boots, and plain gray t-shirt, I knew that was the man for me. He was just like my favorite farmer from my childhood. I walked out of my church on a snowy day in March 1999 on this man's arm, ready to build a life together. As newlyweds, we knew what good food was. We'd both been raised on it our entire lives, with both of our moms being excellent cooks who preserved the summer harvest for wintertime meals. Unfortunately, the little 2-room apartment in Mount Zion did not come with a plot of land next to the concrete parking lot and privacy hedge. So we had to adapt. Hamburger helper it was. You'd be surprised how gourmet you can make cheesy hash brown if you add sausage instead of hamburger. But living out of a box and eating out of a box didn't make me happy. It was relatively easy, but it was uncomfortable. When we were able to move to the country in the winter of 2001, one of the first things I wanted when the ground thawed was to put in a space for our garden. So my father-in-law hooked up his 50-year-old plow and turned over the sod. And I remember standing there, watching those old plow blades cut through the tough grass and roll it over to reveal the deepest, darkest dirt I had ever seen. Now, I also remember, because I taught U.S. history at the time, I could now explain to my juniors how a plow worked and why it was such a big deal when John Deere invented the steel plow for the prairie soil. Strange, I know. The smell of freshly tilled dirt in the spring is something that excites me to this day. It's the start of an aroma of a new start, the beginning of a new season, and full of opportunities. After the garden was worked down several times and tilled smoothly, I set to work planting green beans, corn, tomatoes, radishes. Truthfully, I don't remember everything that was in our first garden, but it was a total delight. My mom bought me my own pressure canner, and I canned my first green beans that year. I felt all was right in the world at the age of 25. After the garden, I had to plant a small orchard. My grandparents had a sour cherry tree, so that was one of the first trees, as well as a Jonagold apple, because Jonathans were my favorite from my grandparents. And we got a Red Haven peach tree. I was in heaven. While my garden is never as weed-free as my grandparents' was, we've been known to have to use the lawnmower to find the plants. It happens. Putting on gardening gloves and harvesting what the soil gives us not only gives me a sense of accomplishment, but it allows me to connect to my past. When our kids came along, it was important to me that they were outside whenever we worked in the garden. I wanted them to grow up in the sunshine, dirt, and fresh air. I had a tent that I'd put up next to the garden when Hannah was 3 or 4 months old, so that I could check on her, listen for her, and even nurse her so I didn't have to go back into the house. Such was my obsession with the garden and fresh, homegrown food. Providing healthy food for our family has always been a top priority and a work in progress. I added hens for eggs in 2008. Several years later, we started raising meat chickens. Poor ugly little things. And in 2022, our son Will, he started raising pigs for his FFA project. Not a bad use of a 3-acre chunk of dirt, and I'm constantly thinking of ways of adding more good things. While I can't give my kids the exact same experiences I had growing up, they do get a good taste of it. They have a crazy mother who rarely buys them boxed macaroni and cheese, frozen pizza, or canned veggies. Our daughter Hannah was out of high school before she'd tasted a Hot Pocket. And my husband had to smuggle frozen pizzas into the house 2 days ago. True story. But our kids do know what microgreens and sourdough tastes like, what it's like to hold a newborn piglet or baby chicks, how to mow the grass safely around the beehives, how much effort goes into canning and freezing vegetables for winter, and that if you name your food, you might end up eating it. I don't always feel like making things from scratch, but I feel like this is a part of my family's legacy that I need to pass along to our kids. My great-great-grandparents were German truck gardeners who grew crops along the Illinois River. They would load up their wagons, hook up the mules, and take their vegetables to downtown Peoria to sell in the city. This is a part of me. While I don't load up my wagon, I do participate in farmers markets and have the occasional farm stand at our house. I want everyone to have access to good food, no matter where they live, because life is so much better living outside of the box.